Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary stories come to life. If you've subscribed for more stories, enjoy the ride now. Thomas Hartwell had always been a light sleeper, a trait that had served him well during his years of xenobiological research on remote worlds where the local fauna frequently mistook scientists for midnight snacks. So when the soft whisper of displaced air brushed across his consciousness at 3 a.m, his eyes snapped open with the practiced alertness of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on the difference between sleep and death. What he saw at the foot of his bed should have sent him scrambling for the plasma rifle mounted on the wall. Instead, Thomas found himself frozen in a combination of terror and fascination that defied every survival instinct he'd developed over 15 years of fieldwork. The woman standing in his shelter was breathtakingly beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, like staring directly into a star. Her skin seemed to glow with its own internal luminescence, pale as moonlight but somehow more substantial, as if she'd been carved from living alabaster by an artist who understood that perfection could be terrifying. Her hair fell in midnight waves past her shoulders, and her eyes were the deep crimson of fresh blood, with an intelligence that suggested she was cataloging every detail of his appearance for reasons he probably didn't want to understand. "Your essence smells so sweet, human," she said, her voice carrying an accent that suggested languages Thomas had never heard. "I have traveled far following your scent." Thomas's scientific mind noted several important details even as his survival instincts screamed at him to reach for weapons. First, she had entered his supposedly secure research shelter without triggering any of his motion sensors or security systems. Second, her canine teeth were visibly elongated, gleaming white and sharp enough to puncture titanium. Third, and perhaps most importantly, she wasn't immediately attacking him, which suggested either restraint or the kind of predatory patience that preferred to play with food before consuming it. "Vampire," Thomas managed to say, his voice coming out as a strangled whisper. "Sanguinari," the woman corrected with what might have been amusement. "Though I suppose the distinction is academic from your perspective. I am Seraphina of the Nocturne Covenant, and you, Thomas Hartwell, have been calling to me for weeks." The fact that she knew his name should have been more alarming, but Thomas found himself oddly calm as his scientific curiosity began to override his terror. "Calling to you how?" Seraphina moved closer with fluid grace that seemed to ignore the concept of gravity. She appeared to glide rather than walk, her movements so smooth they created an hypnotic effect that made Thomas's eyes struggle to track her properly. "Your life essence," she explained, pausing at the edge of his bed with predatory stillness. "It carries a signature unlike anything I have encountered in 3 centuries of existence. Most humans smell like maintenance nutrition. Adequate but uninspiring. But you." She inhaled deeply, her eyes fluttering closed in what looked suspiciously like bliss. "You smell like starlight and possibility." Thomas's xenobiological training kicked in, helping him analyze the situation with scientific detachment despite the fact that he was apparently being stalked by an alien vampire with excellent taste in metaphors. "My research," he said slowly, pieces clicking together. "I've been exposed to exotic radiation from the planetary core samples. It must have altered my biochemistry." "Precisely," Seraphina said, opening her crimson eyes to fix him with a gaze that seemed to look directly into his soul. "Though I suspect the alterations go deeper than simple radiation exposure. Tell me, Dr. Hartwell, have you been experiencing unusual dreams lately? Visions of distant stars and ancient cities?" Thomas blinked in surprise. He had been having strange dreams, vivid experiences that felt more like memories than normal sleep imagery. Dreams of spire cities that twisted into impossible geometries, of beings that moved through space without ships, of technologies that seemed to blend science and art into something approaching magic. "How did you know about the dreams?" "Because," Seraphina said, settling onto the edge of his bed with casual intimacy that made his heart race, "whatever has changed in your biochemistry has made you partially receptive to sanguinary psychic frequencies. You've been unconsciously broadcasting your location to any of my kind within several light years. It's fortunate that I found you first." "Fortunate for whom?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. For both of us, I believe. Seraphina studied him with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. I have a proposition for you, Dr. Hartwell. This planet harbors creatures that hunt during the night hours, things that would consider a lone human researcher to be a delightful midnight snack. I can protect you from them. In exchange, you want to feed on me, Thomas finished, surprised by how calm he sounded. In carefully measured amounts, Seraphina clarified. I am not a mindless predator, despite what your species' entertainment media might suggest. Sanguinari feeding can be mutually beneficial when properly managed. The endorphin release alone is reportedly quite pleasant for the donor. Thomas considered this proposal with the methodical approach he usually reserved for research protocols. He was alone on a hostile planet, weeks away from any potential rescue, studying phenomena that had apparently turned him into a supernatural beacon for alien vampires. His options appeared to be limited to accepting her offer or hoping he could survive whatever nocturnal predators she was warning him about. What guarantee do I have that you won't simply drain me dry the moment I agree? He asked. Seraphina's smile revealed those elegant fangs in all their terrifying glory. None whatsoever. But consider this, if I wanted to kill you, Dr. Hartwell, you would already be dead. I could have drained you in your sleep and been gone before you ever woke. Instead, I'm here negotiating, which suggests I find you more interesting alive than dead. That's oddly reassuring, Thomas admitted. I am an oddly reassuring person, Seraphina replied, and Thomas caught a glimpse of humor in those crimson eyes that made her seem less like a monster and more like a very dangerous woman with an unconventional diet. If I agree to this arrangement, Thomas said carefully, what exactly does the feeding process involve? Physical contact, obviously. A small incision, usually at the wrist or throat for optimal access. The actual consumption of blood, during which you may experience euphoria, heightened awareness, and possibly brief telepathic contact with my consciousness. The entire process typically lasts 15 to 20 minutes. Thomas's scientific mind was already racing with questions about the biochemistry involved, the neurological effects of vampire saliva, and the implications of telepathic contact between species. His survival instincts were screaming that he was about to make a potentially fatal mistake. The part of him that had always been curious about the unknown was fascinated by the opportunity to study an alien species from a perspective no human had ever experienced. All right, Thomas said, making a decision that felt both completely insane and oddly inevitable. I agree to your proposition. Seraphina's smile widened, and for a moment Thomas saw something that looked almost like relief in her expression. Excellent. Shall we begin immediately? Your essence has been calling to me for so long that waiting much longer would be difficult. Thomas extended his wrist toward her, trying to maintain scientific objectivity even as his heart hammered against his ribs. Just, try not to kill me accidentally. I have research to finish. I make no promises about accidental death, Seraphina said solemnly, then grinned in a way that suggested she was joking. Probably. But I will do my best to keep you alive long enough to complete your studies. When Seraphina's fangs pierced his skin, Thomas experienced a sensation unlike anything in his previous experience. The initial pain was sharp but brief, quickly replaced by warmth that spread through his entire body like the most potent drug imaginable. His vision sharpened, colors becoming more vivid, and he could suddenly hear his own heartbeat as clearly as if it were being amplified through speakers. But it was the mental contact that truly amazed him. For a brief moment, he could feel Seraphina's consciousness touching his own, ancient, complex, filled with centuries of memories and emotions that no human mind was equipped to fully comprehend. He caught glimpses of her past, elegant cities that spiraled into the void, art forms that used living light as a medium, a civilization that had achieved things humans could barely imagine. And through it all, he sensed her genuine surprise at the intensity of their connection, her amazement at the taste and quality of his life essence, and something else that felt almost like gratitude. When she finally pulled away, Thomas felt simultaneously drained and energized, as if someone had simultaneously exhausted and recharged his batteries using completely unknown technology. "Well," Seraphina said, looking slightly stunned, "that was unprecedented." "Good unprecedented or bad unprecedented?" Thomas asked, noting that his wrist had already stopped bleeding and was healing with remarkable speed. "Excellent unprecedented," Seraphina replied. "Your essence is not just sweet, Dr. Hartwell, it's transformative. I feel more alive than I have in decades." Thomas studied her face, noting the way her pale skin seemed to glow more brightly and her crimson eyes appeared more vivid. "And I feel different. Stronger. More aware." "The symbiosis," Seraphina murmured, more to herself than to him. "I had theorized it was possible, but I never expected to find a human whose biochemistry was compatible." "Symbiosis?" Thomas asked, though part of him already suspected what she meant. "Mutual benefit rather than simple predation," Seraphina explained. "Your altered biochemistry provides enhanced nutrition that strengthens my abilities, while my feeding process introduces compounds that will improve your cellular regeneration and extend your lifespan. We're not predator and prey, Dr. Hartwell. We're evolving into partners." As dawn began to lighten the sky outside his shelter, Thomas watched Seraphina prepare to leave with the elegant efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of avoiding sunlight. "Will I see you again?" he asked, surprising himself with how much he hoped the answer was yes. "Every night," Seraphina promised, pausing at his doorway to fix him with a gaze that was both predatory and oddly tender. "Until your research is complete, you are under my protection. And perhaps we can learn from each other." As she disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Thomas sat on his bed and stared at his rapidly healing wrist, wondering if he'd just made the best or worst decision of his scientific career. Possibly both. 3 weeks into their nightly arrangement, Thomas Hartwell had developed what he privately called vampire anticipation syndrome, the peculiar condition of spending each day looking forward to being fed upon by a beautiful alien predator. It was, he reflected while calibrating his atmospheric sensors, probably not a healthy psychological development. "The radiation levels in Sector 7 are fluctuating again," Thomas muttered to himself, a habit that had become more pronounced since Seraphina started visiting. "Either the planetary core is having mood swings, or something down there is actively manipulating the energy output." His research had taken on new dimensions since his first feeding with Seraphina. The telepathic flashes he experienced during their connections had given him insights into the planet's energy phenomena that pure human science couldn't have achieved. Apparently, vampire telepathy worked both ways. He was gaining access to sanguinari sensory capabilities that revealed patterns in the data his instruments couldn't detect. "Talking to yourself again?" Thomas didn't jump at the sound of Seraphina's voice anymore, though he still felt his pulse quicken when she materialized in his shelter like elegant smoke-given form. She moved with the same fluid grace as always, but Thomas had learned to read the subtle variations in her posture that indicated her mood and energy levels. "I'm analyzing the data from today's core samples," Thomas replied, gesturing to the holographic displays floating above his workstation. "The energy signatures are becoming more complex, almost like they're responding to external stimuli." Seraphina glided closer to examine the data, her crimson eyes reflecting the light patterns with an intensity that suggested genuine scientific interest rather than polite curiosity. "Show me the temporal correlations." Thomas pulled up the relevant charts, noting how Seraphina studied them with the focused attention of someone who understood advanced astrophysics. Over their weeks together, he discovered that her apparent age of perhaps 30 human years was deceptive. She possessed centuries of accumulated knowledge that spanned multiple scientific disciplines. "There," Seraphina said, pointing to a specific pattern in the data. "Do you see how the fluctuations align with the orbital mechanics of this system's outer planets? The energy source isn't responding to random stimuli, it's resonating with gravitational waves." Thomas felt his excitement spike as he ran the calculations. "You're right. The core isn't just a natural phenomenon, it's some kind of ancient technology that's still active after millions of years." "Not ancient," Seraphina corrected gently. Contemporary. This planet was seeded by the architects within the last 50,000 years, which is practically yesterday by galactic standards. The architects? Thomas asked, though something about the name triggered recognition from their previous telepathic contacts. The species that preceded both humans and Sanguinari, Seraphina explained, settling into the chair across from his workstation with practiced elegance. They left technological artifacts throughout the galaxy before disappearing into whatever dimension or state of existence they currently occupy. Your research station is built on top of one of their installations. Thomas stared at his data with new understanding. That's why the radiation has been affecting my biochemistry so dramatically. I'm not just being exposed to exotic energy, I'm being slowly transformed by architect technology. Precisely, Seraphina said, and Thomas caught something in her tone that suggested this revelation was more significant than casual scientific discovery. Which brings us to the real reason I've been visiting you, Dr. Hartwell. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet's temperature fluctuations. The real reason? Your essence called to me from across space, yes. But the reason I came was because architect technology recognizes compatible consciousness patterns across species barriers. You're not just biochemically altered, you're being prepared for something. Prepared for what? Seraphina's expression became uncharacteristically serious. Evolution. Transcendence. The next phase of development that the architects intended for younger species to achieve when we proved ready. Thomas processed this information with the methodical calm that had gotten him through 15 years of discovering impossible things on alien worlds. And you're here because? Because I'm an exile from my people, cast out for questioning whether the Sanguinari should continue our predatory relationship with other species. Seraphina's voice carried pain that centuries of experience couldn't entirely hide. I've spent decades searching for evidence that cooperation might be more evolutionarily beneficial than predation. Your biochemical compatibility with my feeding process suggests I was right. Their feeding ritual that night took on new significance as Thomas understood he wasn't just providing sustenance, he was participating in an unprecedented biological experiment. When Seraphina's fangs pierced his skin, the telepathic contact was deeper and more complex than previous sessions, revealing layers of her consciousness that she'd kept hidden. Through their connection, Thomas experienced fragments of Seraphina's memories. Elegant debates in chambers that defied three-dimensional architecture, her growing horror as she uncovered evidence of systematic genocide carried out by the Sanguinari against species they considered inferior, and her desperate flight from her homeworld when her attempts to expose the truth marked her for execution. But he also felt her wonder and hope as she discovered that feeding from him didn't just provide nutrition, it was changing her fundamental nature, making her more empathetic, more capable of seeing beyond the predatory instincts that defined her species. I can feel your thoughts more clearly each time, Thomas gasped as she pulled away, his healing factor already closing the feeding wounds. And you're different than you were 3 weeks ago. More human. Not more human, Seraphina corrected, though her smile was warmer than the predatory expressions he'd grown accustomed to. More myself. The person I was before centuries of cultural conditioning taught me that compassion was weakness. Thomas studied her face, noting subtle changes that had occurred over their weeks together. Her features seemed softer somehow, her crimson eyes carrying warmth that hadn't been there initially. And I'm different too. Stronger, faster, more aware of things I shouldn't be able to perceive. The symbiosis is accelerating, Seraphina confirmed. Soon you'll begin manifesting abilities that blur the line between human and sanguinary physiology. Their conversation was interrupted by an alert from Thomas's orbital sensors. Something large was approaching the planet, multiple somethings, actually, with energy signatures that made his instruments emit warnings about potentially hostile vessels. Sanguinari warships, Seraphina said, her expression shifting to the predatory alertness Thomas recognized from their first meeting. They've found me. How many? Thomas asked, checking his defensive systems and finding them laughably inadequate for space combat. 12 vessels of the Nocturne Fleet, Seraphina replied, her enhanced senses apparently capable of analyzing the approaching ships with greater precision than his instruments. Led by the Crimson Sovereign, which means they've sent my former mate to retrieve me. Former mate? Thomas felt an unexpected surge of what might have been jealousy, which was ridiculous given the circumstances. Lord Nightfall of the Eternal Hunt, Seraphina explained, already moving to secure Thomas's research data with efficient urgency. We were bonded for 2 centuries before my exile. He views my association with you as the ultimate betrayal of sanguinary purity. Thomas began emergency protocols for protecting his research, though he suspected his scholarly concerns might be irrelevant if a fleet of vampire warships was approaching with hostile intent. What do they want? To execute me for treason and probably destroy this entire planet as an example to other species who might consider harboring sanguinary fugitives, Seraphina replied with the casual tone of someone discussing unfortunate weather. Unless, of course, you're willing to surrender me to them voluntarily. Thomas looked at the woman who had become far more than a feeding partner over their weeks together, someone whose company he'd grown to treasure and whose transformation from predator to something approaching friend had become the most fascinating aspect of his research. Not a chance, Thomas said firmly. We'll figure something else out. Seraphina's smile could have powered his research station for a week. I was hoping you'd say that. Though I should warn you that protecting me will likely result in your death, the destruction of your life's work, and possibly the complete sterilization of this planet. You know, Thomas said, checking the charge on weapons that were designed for wildlife, not space combat, when you put it like that, it sounds almost romantic. Romance with a vampire, Seraphina mused as the approaching warships began orbital insertion. Your species has such interesting perspectives on courtship. Thomas realized he was grinning despite the approaching doom, partly from adrenaline and partly from the recognition that somewhere between terror and scientific fascination, he'd fallen in love with an alien vampire who was about to get him killed. In the grand scheme of xenobiological research, that seemed like a reasonably appropriate way to go. The Sanguinari warships descended through Kepler 438c's atmosphere like crimson tears in the fabric of space, their bioorganic hulls pulsing with the same luminescence Thomas had come to associate with Seraphina's skin. 12 vessels of impossible elegance, each one a work of art that happened to be armed with weaponry capable of reducing planets to cosmic dust. The Crimson Sovereign is requesting permission to land, Thomas said, monitoring the communication channels with equipment that felt laughably primitive compared to the technology approaching his position. They're not requesting, Seraphina corrected, her posture shifting into the predatory alertness that reminded Thomas she was far more dangerous than her elegant appearance suggested. They're announcing their intention. Lord Nightfall was never one for diplomatic niceties. Thomas watched through his shelter's reinforced windows as the lead vessel settled onto the crystalline plain with organic grace, its hull opening like a flower to disgorge figures that moved with the same fluid motion he'd learned to associate with sanguinary physiology. Even at distance, he could see they were armed and armored in ways that suggested this was not intended to be a peaceful reunion. Tell me about Lord Nightfall, Thomas said, checking his weapon systems and trying not to think about how inadequate they were for the situation. Draconian Nightfall, Lord of the Eternal Hunt, former heir to the Crimson Throne, Seraphina recited with the tone of someone discussing a particularly venomous species of snake. We were bonded for 2 centuries, until I discovered his involvement in the systematic extermination of the Zelani colonies. When I tried to expose the genocide to the Covenant Council, he was the one who cast the vote that condemned me to exile. Sounds like a charming fellow, Thomas muttered, watching the approaching figures with sensors that revealed details he probably didn't want to know. How many of them? 20 warriors of the elite guard, plus Nightfall himself, Seraphina replied, her enhanced senses providing tactical information his instruments couldn't match. All of them enhanced with combat adaptations that make them considerably more dangerous than my civilian modifications. Thomas felt their bond pulse with complex emotions as the Sanguinari delegation approached, Seraphina's mixture of fear, anger, and something that might have been regret, all layered over a determination that felt solid as bedrock. Over their weeks together, their telepathic connection had deepened beyond simple feeding contact into something approaching a permanent mental link. Seraphina of the Nocturne Covenant, came a voice from outside the shelter, speaking in accented English with the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. You will emerge and submit to custody, or face the consequences of continued defiance. That would be my former beloved, Seraphina said dryly. Still as charming as ever. Thomas moved to the shelter's communication system, his scientific curiosity warring with his survival instincts and losing badly. This is Dr. Thomas Hartwell, authorized researcher under Galactic Federation protocols. This planet is under scientific protection, and you're in violation of interspecies law. The response was laughter that managed to convey centuries of aristocratic contempt in a few seconds of sound. Dr. Hartwell, I am Lord Nightfall of the Eternal Hunt. Your Federation protocols are quaint legal fictions that hold no authority over sanguinary justice. Surrender the exile, and your death will be swift. Counteroffer, Thomas replied, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. Leave my planet, and I won't report this incident to the Federation Council as an act of unprovoked aggression. Thomas, Seraphina said quietly, what are you doing? Buying time, Thomas replied, though he wasn't entirely sure for what. And possibly making the worst tactical decision in human history. The shelter's external sensors detected movement as the Sanguinari began positioning themselves around the research station. Through their bond, Thomas could feel Seraphina's analysis of their tactical situation, 21 elite warriors with centuries of combat experience versus one xenobiologist with academic weapons training and an exiled vampire with a guilty conscience. The odds are not encouraging, Seraphina observed. I've survived 15 years of fieldwork by ignoring odds, Thomas replied, activating defensive systems that were designed for wildlife deterrent rather than military engagement. Besides, we have advantages they don't know about. Such as the architect technology that's been altering my biochemistry, Thomas explained, calling up sensor data on his workstation. And the fact that our feeding bond has been accelerating whatever transformation process the planetary systems initiated. Through their connection, Thomas felt Seraphina's sudden understanding and hope. The symbiotic relationship they developed wasn't just changing them individually, it was creating something entirely new, a hybrid consciousness that combined human innovation with sanguinary capabilities. The first attack came without warning, energy weapons that carved through the shelter's outer walls like tissue paper. Thomas dove for cover as superheated plasma scorched the air where he'd been standing, his enhanced reflexes moving faster than human physiology should have allowed. Surrender now, Lord Nightfall's voice echoed through the breached walls, and the human dies quickly. Such a romantic, Seraphina muttered, moving with inhuman speed to a defensive position. 2 centuries together, and he still thinks threats are a form of courtship. Thomas found himself grinning despite the mortal danger, adrenaline and their bond combining to create a state of heightened awareness that made everything seem crystal clear. He could sense the approaching sanguinary warriors with precision that borrowed from Seraphina's enhanced perceptions, while she seemed to be accessing his human ability to improvise and adapt under pressure. Can you reach the communication array? Thomas asked, indicating the equipment that would let them contact Federation forces. Not without exposing myself to crossfire from at least 6 positions, Seraphina replied. Unless what? Unless we try something that's either brilliant or suicidal, Seraphina said, her crimson eyes bright with dangerous possibility. The bond between us has been growing stronger each night. What if we deliberately intensified it? Thomas understood immediately what she was suggesting. Their feeding ritual created temporary telepathic contact, but a deliberate deepening of their connection might create permanent psychic fusion, sharing not just thoughts but actual abilities. The risks? Thomas asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Death, insanity, or transformation into something that's neither human nor sanguinary, Seraphina replied. Also the possibility of creating an entirely new form of consciousness that transcends species limitations. Another energy blast scorched past Thomas's position, close enough to cinch his hair and remind him that their current situation wasn't exactly safe either. Do it, Thomas said, extending his wrist toward her. If we're going to die, let's die doing something unprecedented. Seraphina's bite was different this time, deeper, more intense, creating a connection that felt less like feeding and more like merging. Thomas experienced a sensation like electricity flooding his nervous system as Seraphina's consciousness merged with his own, creating a shared awareness that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Through their fusion, Thomas gained access to vampiric speed and strength, while Seraphina absorbed his human capacity for creative problem-solving and technological adaptation. Together, they moved with coordination that exceeded what either species could achieve independently, their shared consciousness allowing them to anticipate each other's actions with perfect precision. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of either species. Thomas fought with inhuman speed and sanguinary grace, while Seraphina applied human tactical thinking to vampiric combat abilities. Their opponents, expecting to face a single exile and her human pet, found themselves confronting something entirely new, a hybrid entity that combined the best capabilities of both species. When the smoke cleared and the surviving Sanguinari warriors retreated to their ships, Thomas and Seraphina stood among the ruins of his research station, still connected by a bond that had evolved beyond simple feeding into something approaching true synthesis. "Well," Seraphina said, surveying the damage with their shared consciousness, "that was educational." "Educational?" Thomas replied, feeling her amusement through their permanent connection. "We just created an entirely new form of interspecies evolution while fighting off a vampire death squad. I'd call it groundbreaking." "Groundbreaking," Seraphina agreed, pulling him closer with the easy intimacy that had become natural between them. "Though I suspect Lord Nightfall will return with significantly more firepower next time." Thomas looked at the retreating warships and felt no fear, only anticipation. Their bond had given them capabilities that neither species possessed individually, and the architect technology embedded in the planet was still transforming them in ways they didn't fully understand. "Let him come," Thomas said, surprising himself with his confidence. "We'll be ready." Through their shared consciousness, he felt Seraphina's agreement and love, along with something else, hope that their unprecedented connection might be the beginning of something that could change the galaxy's understanding of what was possible when species chose cooperation over conflict. Even if it had started with a midnight intrusion and a request for blood. 5 years after their first midnight encounter, Thomas Hartwell stood in the observation deck of Haven's Edge Station, watching ships from a dozen different species dock with the orbital platform that had become the galaxy's first successful interspecies research and diplomatic facility. The irony wasn't lost on him that what had started as a simple xenobiological survey had evolved into something that was reshaping interstellar politics. "The Federation Council representatives are requesting another demonstration of the synthesis process," Seraphina said, joining him at the viewport with the fluid grace that had never lost its ability to captivate him. "Apparently, the Centaurian delegation still believes our bond is some form of elaborate hoax." Thomas smiled, feeling the warm pulse of amusement through their permanent telepathic connection. Over the years, their relationship had evolved from predator-prey to something approaching true symbiosis, creating a template that other interspecies couples throughout the galaxy were attempting to replicate. "Let me guess," Thomas said, slipping his arm around Seraphina's waist, "they want to see the light show again." Their bond had developed unique manifestations over the years, including the ability to generate visible auroras of energy when their consciousness fully merged. It was a phenomenon that scientists throughout the galaxy were still trying to understand, though Thomas suspected it had something to do with the architect technology that continued to influence their development. The light show, the telepathic demonstration, and probably another request for blood samples, Seraphina confirmed. "Though I think Ambassador Chen is more interested in the political implications than the scientific ones." Thomas nodded, understanding the complexity of their situation. Haven's Edge had become a symbol of what was possible when species chose cooperation over conflict, but it had also attracted attention from factions that viewed interspecies relationships as threats to genetic and cultural purity. "Any word from the Sanguinari Covenant?" Thomas asked. "Lord Nightfall has been suspiciously quiet for the past 6 months, Seraphina replied, her tone carrying the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust peaceful interludes. "Either he's planning something significant, or the Council has finally accepted that our bond represents evolution rather than contamination. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Seraphina, the Federation's chief xenobiologist and one of the few humans who had embraced the concept of human-alien synthesis without reservation. "Thomas, Seraphina, we have a situation," Dr. Chen announced with the brisk efficiency that had made her one of the most respected scientists in the galaxy. "We've detected a massive spatial anomaly approaching this system. Something large enough to dwarf our entire station." Thomas and Seraphina exchanged glances, their bond carrying shared concern and curiosity. "Artificial or natural?" Thomas asked. "Unknown," Dr. Chen replied, leading them toward the station's central command center. "The energy signature is unlike anything in our databases, but there are patterns that suggest intelligence behind the construction." The command center buzzed with activity as personnel from multiple species worked together to analyze the approaching phenomenon. Thomas noted the easy cooperation between humans, Sanguinari, Centaurians, and several other species that had established permanent research facilities on Haven's edge. "There," Dr. Chen said, gesturing toward the main display screen. "It'll be visible in about 30 seconds. What emerged from hyperspace was beyond anything Thomas had imagined in 15 years of studying impossible phenomena. The structure, for it was clearly artificial, stretched across several light-seconds of space, its surfaces covered with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alien in ways that suggested technologies beyond current galactic civilization. "Architect," Seraphina breathed, her enhanced senses apparently recognizing something in the structure's energy patterns. "That's an architect vessel. Or station. Or something that defies our understanding of the distinction." Thomas felt excitement spike through their bond as his scientific curiosity overrode his survival instincts. "They're still alive. The architects are still active in this galaxy." Before anyone could respond, the massive structure began transmitting on frequencies that made every piece of equipment on the station resonate with harmonic vibrations. The message, when it came, bypassed their translation systems entirely and spoke directly to their consciousness in concepts rather than words. "Children of synthesis, * the message conveyed, * you have achieved the first step of transcendence. Attend and receive instruction, *. Thomas found himself moving without conscious thought, drawn toward the station's docking bay by compulsions that felt both foreign and completely natural. Around him, other personnel were experiencing similar effects, though only those involved in interspecies bonding seemed to be responding to the summons. "Fascinating," Dr. Chen observed, apparently immune to whatever force was influencing the bonded individuals. "The architects are selectively calling only those who have achieved some form of synthesis." The transport that carried Thomas, Seraphina, and 12 other bonded pairs to the architect structure moved through space without any visible propulsion system, arriving at a docking port that opened like organic tissue to receive them. Inside, the structure defied three-dimensional logic, with corridors that curved through impossible angles and chambers that seemed larger than the space they occupied. "Welcome," said a figure that materialized from the walls themselves, its form shifting between geometric patterns and vaguely humanoid shapes. "I am the curator, guardian of this facility and instructor to species approaching transcendence." The curator's presence filled their minds with information too complex for normal consciousness to process, but their bonds allowed them to share the cognitive load and understand what was being communicated. "You have achieved the first stage of synthesis," the curator continued, its form settling into something approximately humanoid but clearly not derived from any known species. "Individual consciousness merging across species barriers to create hybrid entities with capabilities exceeding their component parts. This is the foundation upon which true galactic civilization is built." Thomas felt wonder flood through his connection with Seraphina as they realized the implications. Their relationship wasn't just personal evolution, it was part of a larger process that the architects had been guiding for millions of years. "The next stage," the curator explained, "involves the creation of synthesis communities where multiple species can coexist and evolve together, sharing knowledge and capabilities to accelerate development beyond what any single species could achieve." The instruction that followed was unlike any educational experience Thomas had ever encountered. Information flowed directly into their consciousness through their bonds, teaching them technologies and concepts that would allow them to create stable interspecies communities, methods for facilitating synthesis between different biological types, and techniques for managing the psychological challenges of transcending species barriers. "Why now?" Seraphina asked during one of the instruction sessions. "Why reveal yourselves to us at this particular moment?" "Because," the curator replied, "your galaxy is approaching a crisis point. Species that choose isolation and genetic purity will stagnate and eventually destroy themselves through conflict and resource depletion. Only those who embrace synthesis will survive to see the next phase of galactic evolution." When they returned to Haven's Edge, Thomas and Seraphina carried with them knowledge that would transform not just their station but potentially the entire galaxy's approach to interspecies relations. The techniques they'd learned would allow them to facilitate bonds between species that had never successfully interacted, creating a network of synthesis communities that could serve as the foundation for true galactic civilization. "So," Thomas said as they stood in their private quarters, watching the architect structure prepare to depart for whatever dimension it normally occupied, "how do you feel about becoming the parents of a new form of galactic society?" Seraphina's smile carried warmth that had deepened over their years together, along with the confidence of someone who had learned to embrace change rather than fear it. "Considering that our relationship started with you offering to let me feed on your blood, I'd say we've already exceeded most people's expectations for how things might turn out." Thomas pulled her close, marveling as always at how perfectly they fit together, both physically and mentally. Through their bond, he could feel her excitement about the future they were going to build, along with her love for the man who had chosen to see her as a partner rather than a predator. "Besides," Seraphina added, kissing him with the passion that had never diminished despite their years together, "someone needs to show the galaxy that the best relationships begin with a little danger and a lot of trust." As they kissed, their bond created the familiar aurora of light around them, a visible manifestation of the synthesis that had transformed them from two separate beings into something entirely new. Outside their viewport, ships from dozens of species moved through space carrying individuals who hoped to achieve their own forms of transcendence. It was, Thomas reflected, a beautiful way to revolutionize galactic civilization. Even if it had started with an alien vampire breaking into his shelter in the middle of the night and complimenting him on how sweet his essence smelled. Some love stories, he'd learned, were worth waiting centuries for, even when they began with fangs and the promise of being eaten.